well, there's still some people that are on Gideon's team that are out there. And so what we do is we find that Gideon still got his army, that the Midianites have run. But the men, it says, this is where we take off again. We're now in Judges 8. It said, then the men of Ephraim said to him. So it's a region that has all their people, their leaders, their city council, whatever you want to call it. What is this thing if you had done to us, not calling us when you went to fight against Midian? So they're getting their feelings hurt that they weren't invited to the party. That's basically, And they contended with him vigorously. So they're not happy with Gideon. They're mad. Well, Gideon really didn't have to. I mean, he could have probably started and said, well, God really didn't want you guys. That wouldn't go very well. But instead he does some things that good leaders will do. Instead of giving answers, sometimes good leaders give questions. And so he gives back to them and he says, what have I done now in comparison with you? He said, is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? And so he's just kind of saying, aren't your grapes better? Aren't y'all all that? Aren't y'all important? No big deal, And he said, God has given the leaders of Midian, Oreb, and Zeb into your hands. And what was I able to do in comparison with you? So in other words, he's praising them for piling on. When I say piling on, after this battle, the Midianites ran, and Gideon pursued but didn't give rapid chase. And so it's like the people of Israel are watching, and after this thing has happened, the next morning they know the Midianites are running. And so all these people who were really not in the army were whatever, they're kind of standing around, and they got involved, and they started running after the Midianites, and they're killing them. And so the guys are running and trying to get away, and they're wiping them out. So they're doing Gideon's job. Nobody told them to do it. But they saw that there's weakness in the enemy, and so they're taking advantage. And so, when he said, what was I able to do in comparison with you? And notice Gideon's also very humble. He said, it's almost like he said, well, I've only got 300 men, and you guys did a lot of the work. Battle's over, but you guys are cleaning up and doing a great job, whatever. So it says, then their anger towards him subsided when they said that. They're like, oh, yeah, maybe we are. Maybe we are kind of all-powerful and whatever, And maybe I shouldn't say this and give the secret out to other countries, but Donald Trump does some of that. You'll see him with some dignitary, and he's praising them for what they've done, and you're like, really? We're spending how much money, and they're doing what? And he's praising them for it? Yeah, right. He is, but that's a good leader. He is, so they've settled down. Now you got to get back in context. Gideon's got 300 men. It said, then Gideon and the 300 men were with him, came to the Jordan and crossed over, weary, but yet pursuing. So Gideon and his army have been up all night. They've been fighting all night. They started, after darkness, and with the trumpets and breaking and the fires and everything, breaking the pots and lighting the fires and confusing the enemy. They've been up all night, so they're tired. Now the other people that are with Israel have been, many of them probably didn't stay up all night for the battle. They probably were sleeping and everything. But in the morning, word probably got around that, hey, Midianites are running. You want to go chase them? Yes, let's go. So it said that he got over to the men of Succoth, and he says, please give loaves to the bread of the people who are following me, for they are weary. But I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. And so the battle's won, but the kings aren't defeated. You got to defeat them. Gideon knows that. He's still trying to go. And he basically is just saying, can you feed my troops? They've been faithful to me. They've been faithful to God, and they've done this. Can you feed them? And the leaders of Succoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hands, that we should give bread to your army? And I think that phrase, I don't really know what to do with it. In a way I do. They kind of said, are their hands in your hands? And I don't think they literally mean have you cut their hands off. But I think if you think about a prisoner and everything, is generally, your hands are tied, they lead forward. And they're saying that Gideon could be able to reach out and grab their hands, and their hands are in his hands, he owns them. he's got them. They're captives. I think that's kind of the deal. I don't think they really meant that, you're supposed to cut their hands off, whatever. But I think they're saying, are their hands in your hands? And they're saying, we don't see them. And so then they're saying, why are you all that? And why should we give bread to your army? Oh, Gideon's not happy. All right, Gideon says, when the Lord has given these guys, Zebah and Zalmunna, into my hands, then I will thrash your bodies with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. Well, the thing that's a little kind of funny about this, remember we went back, and so there's still a lot of people out there, a lot of military-age men and everything. They're not in Gideon's army. They're from these other communities and whatever. And so that, for Gideon's kind of a bold statement, because they potentially could band up against him. There's enough people in Israel still. They could form their own army, and Gideon would not be able to defeat them. If we're just talking about man scale, man things, not God things. And so he threatens and he says, I'm going to beat you. And so then he went up from there to Penuel and spoke with them. And the men of Penuel answered him just as the men of Succoth had answered. So he spoke also to the men of Penuel, saying, when I return safely, I will tear down this tower. We don't know what was there. Archaeologists not going to be able to find a tower that doesn't exist. But they had some kind of tower that obviously they were proud of. I guess it would be like saying, this is our city hall, and this is our symbol, and that we've spent a lot of work and money and time and everything in this. And Gideon sees it, and he says, obviously that's a big thing to you guys. And he said, when I get back, we're going to tear that down because you didn't feed my soldiers. When I return safely, I'll tear down this tower. Now, Zebah and Zalmunna. Now you also kind of maybe have to put this in. Let's look at it from the perspective of the men of Succoth and Penuel. In that, he's only got 300 men. They probably, they can look at that and they can say, yeah, he's not a threat. He's going to go there and he's chasing. I'll tell you in a minute, but we already know. So I'll just get there, sort of. He's chasing 15,000 men with 300 men. So they're thinking, yeah, you're not coming back. We're not going to worry about you. You're not a threat to us. So they could do that. Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor. Oh, here's the next verse. I just didn't get far enough. Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, and their armies with them, about 15,000 men. All who were left of the entire army of the sons of the east. For the fallen were, how many people did the 300 people of Gideon defeat and then put them on the run, and now they've been put to death? That was 120,000 swordsmen. That alone, just taking those two numbers, 300 versus 120,000, it was really 135,000 because you can add the 15,000 in. But that's incredible. But I think the other thing about it is, if you were, and let's face it, Gideon is not a military, what's the term? Strategist. He's not that kind of person. But Gideon does what God tells him to do. But if you think about just kind of what you're dealing with, if you had people who had different weapons and you wake them up at night, we know from the history of time, Roman armies and everything, they had people who threw stone, slingshots like David, and there are people who had spears and whatever, the different parts of the army. Well, swordsmen, their weapon is right here. And so that also kind of lends to people, if you scare them and they wake up quickly and they think the army's there and they start slashing, that's why it works so well for them to kill each other. Somebody with a stone and it's going to take them wait a minute, you're on my team, So that probably didn't happen as easily with the swordsmen. They drew and started cutting, and they're afraid. And so, that whole thing about the battle So Gideon went up by the way of those who lived in tents on the east of Nobah, and then these words are always, Jogbeha, and attacked the camp when the camp was unsuspecting. In other words, the other term that gets used for unsuspecting is secure. And so I think you've got to kind of put both of those together, but the camp was not expecting Gideon to attack. That's true. But the camp would have, we got 15,000 men. The camp, welcome Micah. I see you've got guests, welcome. So the camp would have their sentries. They would be around there waiting for something to happen. They should have been on their guard. It was, yes, it wasn't dealing with them in an open battlefield and going like that, but still, it's still taking a pretty good risk. And Gideon with his 300 men jumped in, and it said that when the two kings, Zebah and Zalmunna, fled, he pursued them and captured the two kings of Midian and routed the entire army. So now 300 men have defeated, not only 120,000, but 15,000 more. Yes, we're at the end of Judges 8:12 is where I am. 8:12 is the last verse. The humidity makes paper stick together a little more too. Okay, now we're up on 13. Then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres, and he captured a youth from Succoth and questioned him. Now this is strategy. This is brilliant. And so he finds some teenager running around, and he captures him, he brings him in. Teenagers are kind of funny. You don't know if they're going to kind of go in there and say, yeah, you can't touch me, or sing like a canary. Well, I think Gideon probably sits the teenager down, and he probably, kind of may have given him some street cred, like, hey, you're impressive, I've got my army, but you're all that. And he said, he may have started a conversation with the guy. What do you know about Succoth? What do you know about their leaders? What do you know? Who's in charge? And so, if you have an adult, they may know it. They may kind of figure out what Gideon's trying to do. But a teenager might figure out, not really know that, and say, oh yeah, I'm so proud of my town. I'm so proud of my leaders. These are my leaders. And it even may have been kind of even boastful, thinking, well, who's Gideon? So he may have even said, yes, well, this is our mayor, and this is our head of city council, and this is our police chief, and this is our fire chief. And so Gideon gets this teenager just sing on the whole structure of Succoth. He knows who the people are. Now, if he had gone in and tried to take over, then he'd try to be sorting them out, because Gideon wouldn't know who these people are. He encountered them trying to go there. He said, will you give my people bread? They said no. And he said, I will beat you when I get back. And he leaves. On the way back, he gets the teenager, and the teenager spills the beans, so to speak, and tells who all the people are. And not only that, but it said the youth wrote down for him, the princes of Succoth and his elders, 77 men. So, yeah, it's a pretty good list to remember. But the teenager, out of pride or whatever, out of fear, we don't know what the whole deal was, but he laid it out. And so it said that, so then Gideon came to the men of Succoth. He gets to the group. He's got his 300 behind him. He says, behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, concerning whom you taunted me, saying, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are weary? So Gideon has walked the walk, talked the talk, and he's back at them. He said, here they are. And so then he basically can say, they say, oh, well, you don't, they could say, you don't know who our leaders are. And he says, au contraire, I have a list. I can pull this out. And he said, well, so-and-so, please step forward. Well, so-and-so, please step forward. And so when he does that, he took the elders of the city and thorns of the wilderness and briars, and he disciplined the men of Succoth with them. They get a public spanking. And then, so he's also traveling, and he went to Penuel, and he tore down the tower and killed the men of the city. Took care of them too. He said, I'll be back. We're going to tear down the tower. And he did. Now, then he talked to the kings, and he said, what kind of men were they whom you killed at Tabor? And they said, they were like you, each one resembling the son of a king. And he's basically saying, these were your people that we killed, and they did pretty well. He said, this is when this is revengeful words. They were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if only he had let them live, I would not kill you. Doesn't sound good to them. So he said to Jether, his firstborn, rise up, kill them. So this is Gideon telling his son, kill them. Well, he's a young man. Probably had never killed anybody. And this is one of those things, Dad. I'm afraid. These are kings. And then the kings taunt him and say, "Rise up yourself and fall on us. For as the man, so is his strength." In other words, are you really one of those people that has to issue orders, or can you take things into your own hands? I think they were also saying, well, he hadn't killed us yet. Maybe this is a ploy that'll work. If we can get him to say, yeah, okay, if you're not going to do it, we don't have to do that. He's kind of testing his son. His son failed. That's okay. He's still a father, and he's still a leader and everything else. And so Gideon arose, killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and took the crescent ornaments which are on their camels' necks. Now, so we're getting into some interesting things about them and their army and everything else. And so what we're going to find is that just like people wear certain things to identify who they are, you get an airplane, a stewardess will have wings, and a name badge. A police officer will have a badge. They're things. Well, these people for the army, their camels had some kind of big golden crescent thing on them, so they could say, he could be riding up and say, oh, that's one of the kings. That's important, And so there were ways to identify, and they did that. But another thing, they wore earrings. We'll get to that. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, both you and your son, also your son's son, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian." So because he's been successful, these people who had been Baal worshiping are now saying, "Gideon, you got it. You lead us. You take it." And not only that, but we're basically saying you're going to be a king and a dynasty, and your children will lead, and we're all in. But Gideon said to them, now this is the George Washington statement, remember? "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." So after Washington's term, they said, "We want you to basically be our king." And he said, "No, we didn't fight this war to have a king. We didn't fight this war to have one person. We fought this war to have a representative group of people making these decisions." And so the other thing, if I'm not mistaken, Washington actually didn't have any children either, right? I don't think he had any kids. But still, he said, "No, I'm not going to be your king. Y'all figure it out, but we're not doing that." And so that was part of American independence too, is we decided no king, we're not going to do that. Yet, Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over my son, shall rule, the Lord you'll rule over you." Yet Gideon said to them, "I will request of you that each of you give me an earring from the spoil." Because they were Ishmaelites, the people that they conquered, and they wore gold earrings. So they'd have one per ear and whatever. And so basically he just asked, "Can I get earrings?" Which, if you're kind of in the big scheme of things, the spoils of war, there's a lot of stuff still out there. One little earring, they're like, "Sure, fine, no big deal. Yeah, you can have an earring." And so it said, "We shall surely give them." So they spread out a garment, and every one of them threw an earring there from his spoil. So, all of these people who have conquered this army of 135,000, they started putting earrings on this garment. The weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold. I think a shekel's like a big weight. It's not a little weight, it's a big weight. It's like a gold bullion, it's a bigger thing. Not into weights and measures, but basically it's 1,700 of those. And he said, "Besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple robes which are on the kings of the Midians, and besides the neckbands are on their camels' necks." He's still saying the spoils were huge. But Gideon's take, just with the earrings, was impressive. It said Gideon made it into an ephod, which is it's a thing that you put on a pole, a symbol or whatever. The way that we've run into ephod before, which I'm going to kind of give you a little keys to the kingdom on medicine too. One of the symbols that medicine has, if you'll see even in like the EMS Star of Life that has 6 points, that's an X with one in the middle. They're using ambulances and everything else. That's one symbol you'll see, but you'll see like the snakes intertwined too. That actually comes from two different cultures for medicine. And one of them is it comes from all the way in Greece when you had Hippocrates and everything else, that was a symbol of healing for them. Now, if you go to Israel, the symbol for them, that when, and you look back in the time of Moses, with the area that they were in at the time had poisonous snakes that would bite them and they would die. And so God told Moses to make an ephod, make a thing that was probably the snakes, and they would leave it stuck in the ground. And basically God told them, if you get bit, look at that and you'll live. And we can sit there going, huh? What? That's all it takes, yeah. So it's a miraculous thing, and you can spend all day trying to say, well, there are some things that can happen with a snake bite, then you're not going to die, because a snake is also like a human being or whatever. If I give Micah a syringe and I say, I want you to start sticking these people, here's some fluid and do it, some of them are going to do this, you're not going to get them. Some of them you might scratch. Some of them you're going to ram it all home. Same thing with a snake bite. Snake bite, depending on what they're doing, how ready they are, they may swing and miss, they may hit you, they may implant, they may not give venom, and then sometimes they'll give it all. So you can still say that, and I think the studies are a fourth to a third of all snake bites don't have venom. So just because you're bit doesn't mean you're going to die. That's probably the good news. Some people freak out. You don't have to. And oh, by the way, this is your public service announcement. If you get bit by a snake, here's your first aid kit. Go to a hospital. Don't do anything else. Just go to the hospital. Don't do anything else. Just go to the hospital. So anyway, so they had an ephod. So that's a symbol, and he basically did that. Placed it in the city Orpha with all the Israel placed, and all Israel played the harlot with it there, so it became a snare to get in his household. So they are still kind of not doing what God wanted them to. But it says, so Midian, they had 40 years of peace. So Midian was subdued before the sons of Israel, and they did not lift up their heads anymore. And the land was undisturbed for 40 years in the days of Gideon. So Gideon didn't become ruler. He didn't have to get involved again. Things were good. And it said that then Jerubbaal, which means we know that's Gideon still, that contends with Baal, the son of Joash went up and lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons who were his direct descendants, for he had many wives. 70 sons? His concubine, which was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he named him Abimelech. That means, I think it's brother of the king. Yeah. You got something that says, okay. And Gideon, the son of Joash, died at a ripe old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. And then it came about, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the sons of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. Thus the sons of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. Nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in accord with all the good that he had done to Israel. So, my conclusions. Number one, we look back at Gideon. Number one conclusion is Gideon is human. Gideon is not perfect. Gideon shows his humanity in that he has fears. The first part of the story, he's trying to get his wheat refined. He's doing it in the vine press because it's the wrong season, so that the enemy won't know that he's in there and come and steal it from him. So he's human. He's human because God tells him to do things, and he's like, well, I need a sign. God gives him the sign. He said, well, I need another sign. God gives him, well, I need another sign. Despite, I'm sure, that they had heard, there's, their verses, don't test God. We're not supposed to do that. We're supposed to have faith in God, but we're not supposed to test him. Gideon tests God in these two chapters many times. I mean, just like Gideon's like, So Gideon's human. I think the other thing that we can take from this, in not just this passage, but we can take kind of a principle that, I don't know if you've ever heard this, but nature hates a vacuum. Moses wasn't around, and they're in the promised land, and they need leaders. I said leaders. They didn't need kings and whatever, but they needed people to direct them. And so that's where the judges come in. That's where Samson comes in. That's where Deborah comes in. All these judges come in to fill that role for Moses. But still, they're wayward people. Another thing I think that I like to see from these passages is that God sees, it says God looks at the heart, for when you're talking about David. God sees who Gideon is. God knows who Gideon is. But God develops Gideon. Gideon really doesn't want anything to do with any of this stuff. He's afraid. And God takes him and develops him. God says, yeah, he's got what it takes. I just need to get him there. The other thing is that God proves it's not by Gideon's, in whatever word you want to throw there. It's not by Gideon's wisdom that they win. He's not a statistician. Not a statistician. Strategist. It's not by Gideon's powers. It's not like Gideon has, a leader who can call people to himself. It's not by Gideon's skill. We very quickly find that Gideon is not a warrior. Gideon's hiding in the wine press trying to just get food. He's just trying to work on what he's got to eat. It never says that Gideon is a mighty warrior who's, like how they describe Goliath, a mighty man who from his birth has been trained in military ways. That's not Gideon. So God basically doesn't, he chooses Gideon. It proves it's not by Gideon, it's by God. God's still in charge. The numbers even, I told you there's like 135,000 versus 300. God proves it's not by numbers that you win this either. Now, the next thing I think that you got to kind of see in here is that humans like heroes, humans like leaders. Based on the rain, I'm going to throw this. There's that Christian saying, humans like heroes and leaders, etc., when they should frog. Remember the statement: fully rely on God, frog. All over rain, they should frog. They should, but they don't. Gideon says to them that he will not be their ruler and his family will not rule over them. He says that. But the next chapters, which I don't have time and we're not going into, but Abimelech becomes king. He actually says, hey, there's an opening. I got street cred. My dad was Gideon. I want to be king. And he does. Gideon walks away from leading them. He doesn't do that. But his son does. So even though Gideon's told them he's not going, his son should have known that, he still does it. And I think the other thing that you got to kind of get is that human beings were people, and people still sometimes revert back to their ways. And so after all of this stuff that has happened with Gideon, all the things that they suffered, 40 years later, it's another generation. They forget what it was like when they were living in the caves, when they were hiding from the Midianites, when the Midianites would come in and steal all their animals and take all their food. They forget, and they still go back to Baal. And so those are just some thoughts I have kind of about the whole Gideon story, is that he's an amazing person that certainly deserves 2 chapters of this. But at the same time, you don't look at Gideon and say, yeah, he's a born ruler. Yeah, he's a military. Yeah, he's good at war. He's good with dealing with people. No, you can't even say that. Gideon does what God tells him, and Gideon's flawless. And he's got flaws and everything else. Pastor, I see that this is the first Sunday. We do communion first Sunday. And so he has the communion, and we'll get that passed out. So, can you take Gideon and put him in the Lord's Supper? I think you can. So Gideon was a person that was faithful. Even though he had all these questions, even all these, he's human, all these other things, but he still did what God told him to do. Even though most people would say, hey, Gideon, you're crazy. Hey, Gideon, you're nuts. This is crazy. You want to whittle an army down? No, you want to build a bigger army. No, you don't want to. Yeah. There's all these things that Gideon did. Well, we also, this is a moment that we're remembering, but in a real way too. We're celebrating an event that happened because Jesus Christ took his disciples to the upper room, and he basically took bread and he broke it and he said, "This is my body, which is given for you. This is my blood, which is shed for you." He's done these things with these fallible human beings. One thing that I'm always still struck with that one of my teachers, she told us in seminary, she said, what did the disciples do after Jesus died? They went back to what they were doing before, just like Gideon. Jesus doesn't find them preaching the gospel and moving through the countries and doing that. He finds them fishing. Jesus is sitting on the bank cooking a fish, and they're like out, and they said, hey, but they didn't do what he told them to do. They are human. They went back to just fishing. But the example that Jesus also makes is he's faithful. And when it came time after this deal, when it came time, he says, Lord, take this cup from me. I know what's ahead. I don't want it. I don't really want to, for us as humans, I always wonder, the Romans were experts at torture. I don't know how much clothes Jesus even had on hanging up there. He may not have had a piece of anything. He knows that's going to happen. He knows they're going to spit on him. They're going to mock him. They're going to say bad things about him. They're going to beat him. He knows that all this is coming. But he does the thing that most of us couldn't do. He surrendered. I see patients in the hospital that have cancer or whatever, and the families are like, we're going to fight. We're going to fight. And you're like, but you're Christian. And Paul says to live is Christ, to die is gain. Why would I want, yes, I'm fine with treatments and everything, but at a point, why would I fight this cancer when I can surrender and be with God? I'm not saying to bump myself off or anything. God's still in charge of all that. But, do I need CPR? What's it going to do? I have to die to have CPR. Is it going to really help me? And why am I so afraid? Jesus was not afraid. Jesus faced Pilate and was not afraid. Jesus faces a guy who's got the power of Jesus' entire life in his hands, no debate. And Jesus never says, you can't touch me. He says, who do you say I am? He knows it's God's plan. He's got to do it. He doesn't want to, but he does. He's faithful. He surrenders. And there's a fun thing I do with my residents too it's human. Micah, stick up your hand. Good job, Michael. Good job. A little more here. You go to humans, and this is a special environment, I know that. But if you just walk up to anybody and have them do this, and you start pushing, they push back. You did a little more than he did. But it's our human nature. We push back. And so, like the first female resident that I did that with, actually, because I went around the room and did it with, and I've done it many times. But, I just all the way back, I was like, why did you're different. She didn't know what I was doing, but I was like, why did you let me push? And she goes, I trust you. I went, okay. But as human beings, we have a tendency to push. Jesus could have pushed. When I say it this way, and I really, in the purest sense of the way of this, Jesus could have rained hail down on the Romans and all those people. They said, what's the deal? 10,000 angels would have been to his rescue. He gets up on that cross. Jesus. He doesn't complain, and he doesn't fight. He doesn't do it. But looking back as Christians, we got to know he could have. This could have been a different deal. And even his disciples don't really understand this. Judas is thinking, hey, I got the money and I got the leader. Why aren't we in charge? Here, let's push this Jesus out. Now's the time. Let's get him in front of. I've seen the miracles he can do. Surely he can contain the Romans. Let's get him out there. I don't think Judas ever thought that what's really going to happen is that we kill him. I don't know. But Judas has to deal with that. But Judas is really looking for an earthly leader. He wants somebody to take charge. They're all still looking for the glory days of Israel. They don't realize that Jesus is not about all that. He's not going to be an earthly king. He's going to be a heavenly king. So anyway, if you'll take your